Saint Faustina wrote in her diary, a truth that carries great weight and quiet urgency. I often attend upon the dying, and through entreaty obtain for them trust in God's mercy, and God grants them the grace of deep interior peace. Diary, 1797. In these words, Jesus revealed to her that the moment after death is not distant, abstract, or indifferent, but deeply connected to the choices and prayers made while life still breathes. Have you ever considered what truly happens to a soul immediately after death? Have you ever reflected on how your prayers may affect souls who have already crossed that threshold? And have you ever wondered why Jesus chose to whisper his warnings to Saint Faustina rather than proclaim them loudly to the world? Jesus did not reveal truths about departed souls to frighten Saint Faustina. He revealed them to awaken responsibility, compassion, and spiritual maturity. What he showed her was simple but severe in consequence. Souls do not vanish after death, nor do they become unreachable. They enter a state where mercy, justice, and love meet, and the living remain mysteriously connected to them. Saint Faustina was taught that many souls after death suffer not because God is cruel, but because they arrive unprepared for the fullness of His holiness. Jesus warned her that indifference toward the dead is one of the great spiritual blind spots of humanity. People grieve bodies but forget souls. They mourn loss but neglect prayer. And this neglect, though often unintentional, carries consequences in the spiritual order. Jesus whispered to Faustina because the warning is subtle, not dramatic. He revealed that souls after death become entirely dependent on God's mercy and on the prayers of the living. They can no longer merit. They can no longer choose. They can no longer repair what was left unfinished. What remains for them is hope, purification, and waiting. This is why Jesus emphasized to Faustina that prayer for the departed is not optional devotion. It is an act of justice and love. Souls after death are not passive memories. They are living souls in transition, fully conscious, fully aware, fully longing for God, and they feel abandonment deeply when forgotten. The warning Jesus whispered was not about fear of punishment. It was about the danger of spiritual negligence. A world that forgets the dead becomes spiritually shallow. A soul that never prays for the departed gradually loses awareness of eternity. And when eternity fades from awareness, faith weakens. Saint Faustina understood that Jesus entrusted her with this teaching because divine mercy does not end at the grave. Mercy extends beyond death, but it requires cooperation. God wills that souls be saved, purified, and brought into glory. Yet He also wills that the living participate in this work through prayer, sacrifice, and remembrance. This is the heart of the warning. When the living forget the dead, love grows cold. And when love grows cold, faith itself begins to erode. Jesus whispered these truths because they must be received with humility, not fear, with responsibility, not superstition, with love, not curiosity. And Saint Faustina listened. Jesus taught Saint Faustina that one of the greatest misunderstandings about death is the belief that everything is finished once a soul leaves the body. According to what he revealed to her, death does not end relationship, responsibility, or communion. It changes the condition of the soul, but it does not isolate it from the living church. The warning Jesus whispered was clear. The living and the dead remain united in ways most people rarely consider. Saint Faustina learned that immediately after death, the soul stands in truth before God. There are no illusions, no excuses, no distractions. Everything is seen as it truly is. And while God's mercy is infinite, the soul's openness to that mercy depends on how it lived, how it loved, and how it responded to grace. Jesus warned her that many souls are shocked not by God's justice, but by their own lack of preparation. This is where the warning becomes serious. Jesus revealed that many departed souls suffer unnecessarily because the living assume their fate is already sealed. People say, they are in God's hands now, and stop praying. But Jesus showed Saint Faustina that this assumption often leads to neglect. Souls in purification depend greatly on the prayers offered for them on earth. When those prayers are absent, their purification is prolonged, not as punishment, but as consequence. Jesus emphasized to Faustina that prayer for the dead is not symbolic. It is effective, it brings relief, it accelerates purification, It consoles souls who can no longer help themselves. The warning he whispered was that indifference from the living causes real spiritual suffering for the departed. Not because God abandons them, but because God has chosen to involve the living in the economy of mercy. Saint Faustina understood that the greatest danger is not disbelief in purgatory, but forgetfulness. Forgetfulness weakens charity. Forgetfulness reduces faith to what is visible. Forgetfulness shrinks the horizon of eternity until the soul thinks only of earthly life. Jesus warned her that a faith which forgets the dead will eventually forget heaven. Another essential part of this teaching concerns responsibility. Jesus revealed that the living often focus on their own spiritual growth, while ignoring the duty of mercy toward departed souls. This imbalance, he warned, distorts the Christian life. True spirituality includes remembrance, intercession, and sacrifice for those who can no longer act for themselves. Saint Faustina was taught that every Mass offered for the dead, every prayer spoken with intention, every sacrifice united to divine mercy carries weight in eternity. These acts do not disappear. They reach souls who are waiting, longing, and hoping. And Jesus warned that when these acts are neglected, souls experience a deep sense of abandonment, not despair, but loneliness. The warning, therefore, is not harsh. It is sobering. Love must extend beyond the grave, faith must reach further than memory, and mercy must be practiced not only for the living, but for those who have passed into eternity. Jesus whispered this truth because it requires attentive hearts, not fearful ones. Jesus further taught Saint Faustina that the warning about departed souls is closely tied to truth, not emotion. After death, the soul no longer lives by impressions or feelings, but by reality as God sees it. There is no confusion, no self-deception. The soul understands clearly what it loved, what it neglected, and how it responded to grace while on earth. This clarity itself becomes part of the soul's purification. Jesus warned Faustina that many people live as if spiritual debts disappear at death. In reality, nothing meaningful is erased. Everything is transformed into truth. Acts of love remain love. Acts of neglect remain neglect. And unfinished conversion becomes the soul's greatest sorrow, not because God is unforgiving, but because the soul now sees what it postponed. This is why Jesus insisted that prayer for the departed is an act of profound realism. It recognizes that souls continue their journey toward God after death, and that this journey can be helped by the living. Faustina learned that heaven respects human freedom so deeply that God allows the love of the Church on earth to assist souls who can no longer assist themselves. Jesus warned her that when the living fail to pray for the dead, they unintentionally accept a false theology, the idea that salvation is purely individual. In truth, salvation is communal. Souls are saved within the body of Christ, not in isolation. The neglect of prayer for the departed weakens this communion and slowly erodes the sense of spiritual responsibility among the living. Another part of the warning concerned timing. Jesus revealed that many souls suffer longer in purification, not because their faults were great, but because no one remembers them. Forgotten souls are not unloved by God, but they are deprived of the help God desires to give them through others. This reality places a serious responsibility on those still living. Saint Faustina understood that remembrance is an act of justice. To remember the dead is to acknowledge that love does not end with death. To pray for them is to affirm that mercy operates beyond time. Jesus warned that a faith which does not practice remembrance becomes shallow, focused only on present comfort rather than eternal truth. Jesus also made clear that the warning was not meant to burden consciences with fear, but to form them in charity. He showed Faustina that one sincere prayer offered for a departed soul carries more value than many words spoken without intention. What matters is not quantity, but love united to trust in divine mercy. Through these teachings, Faustina came to understand that neglecting the dead is not merely a forgotten devotion, it is a spiritual loss for both the departed and the living. The living lose compassion, the departed lose assistance, and the Church loses part of its spiritual mission. The warning Jesus whispered, therefore, is simple but demanding. Love must cross the boundary of death. Mercy must reach where human hands cannot, and faith must remain aware that eternity begins the moment life ends. This teaching does not ask for fear, it asks for fidelity. Jesus also warned St. Faustina that one of the most dangerous spiritual errors is to believe that mercy operates automatically after death, without cooperation from the living. He made it clear to her that divine mercy is infinite, but it is not mechanical. It works through love, prayer, sacrifice, and conscious participation in God's plan. When these are absent, mercy is not denied, but its effects are delayed. Saint Faustina learned that many people misunderstand God's mercy as something that eliminates responsibility. Jesus corrected this misunderstanding by showing her that mercy always invites response. On earth, the response is conversion. After death, the response is purification, and between the two stands the living church, called to assist through prayer and remembrance. Jesus warned her that when the living grow careless about departed souls, they also grow careless about their own eternity. Forgetting the dead slowly weakens vigilance. It reduces awareness of judgment, purification, and final union with God. Over time, faith becomes focused only on earthly concerns, and eternity becomes abstract. This spiritual dullness, Jesus explained, is one of the enemy's quiet victories. Another part of the warning concerned habit. Jesus showed Faustina that neglect of prayer for the dead often begins innocently. People intend to pray later. They assume others will do it. They believe a single funeral mass is sufficient. But over time, this habit of postponement becomes indifference. And indifference, though subtle, carries serious spiritual consequences. Saint Faustina was taught that the dead are not helped by vague goodwill. They are helped by concrete acts of mercy, a spoken prayer, a mass intention, a sacrifice offered intentionally. These acts create real effects in the spiritual realm. Jesus warned that good intentions without action do not relieve suffering souls. Jesus also emphasized that praying for the dead forms humility in the living. It reminds the soul that it too will one day depend entirely on mercy. This awareness protects the heart from pride and illusion. A soul that regularly prays for the departed remains grounded in truth, aware of its own fragility and need for grace. The warning Jesus whispered was therefore not only about helping departed souls, it was about forming living souls. Those who pray for the dead grow in charity, patience, and hope. Those who neglect them risk becoming spiritually shallow, self-centered, and forgetful of eternal realities. Saint Faustina understood that this teaching was not meant for a few devout individuals, but for the entire church. Prayer for the dead is not an optional devotion for the spiritually inclined. It is a duty rooted in love and justice. Jesus warned that when this duty is ignored, the church loses part of its spiritual strength. The message is clear. Mercy must be practiced intentionally. Love must be expressed concretely, and faith must remain attentive to both sides of eternity. Jesus whispered this warning because it demands interior maturity, not emotional reaction. Jesus further explained to St. Faustina that the warning about departed souls also concerns urgency. He taught her that time, as humans experience it, no longer exists for souls after death. Yet urgency remains, not because God is impatient, but because the soul's longing for God is intense and uninterrupted. This is why delay on earth has real consequences in eternity. When prayer is postponed, assistance is postponed. When remembrance is delayed, relief is delayed. Saint Faustina learned that many people assume prayers for the dead can wait. Jesus corrected this assumption by showing her that love is most effective when it is immediate. Souls in purification experience longing continuously. They do not suffer intermittently. Therefore, help given without delay becomes a profound act of mercy. The warning Jesus whispered was that procrastination in charity often disguises itself as normal life, but spiritually, it creates real absence. Jesus also taught Faustina that prayer for departed souls must be intentional. Vague remembrance is not the same as intercession. Saying, "I remember them," is not the same as offering a prayer, a mass, or a sacrifice. Mercy acts through intention. Without intention, even good thoughts remain sterile. This is why Jesus emphasized specificity, to name the dead, to offer prayers deliberately, to unite sacrifices consciously to divine mercy. Another part of the warning concerned exchange. Jesus revealed that souls helped by prayer are not passive recipients. Once purified and united with God, they become powerful intercessors for those who assisted them. This truth is often ignored. The living think only of what they give, not of what returns. But Jesus showed Faustina that mercy circulates. Love offered does not disappear. It multiplies. Saint Faustina understood that praying for the dead strengthens hope in the living. It teaches the soul to see life as preparation, not possession. It restores balance between earthly responsibility and eternal destiny. Jesus warned that when prayer for the departed disappears, the spiritual imagination shrinks, heaven becomes distant, judgment becomes abstract, and faith becomes reduced to moral effort rather than relationship with eternity. Jesus also clarified that fear should never motivate prayer for the dead. Fear distorts mercy. The correct motivation is love rooted in truth. Souls are not helped by anxiety. They are helped by trustful charity. Faustina learned that prayers offered with calm confidence in divine mercy carry great power, even when they are simple. The warning Jesus whispered reaches its depth here. Neglect of the dead is not neutral. It forms habits in the heart. A soul that rarely prays for the departed slowly forgets its own dependence on mercy. A soul that remembers the dead regularly remains awake, humble and attentive to grace. Saint Faustina received this teaching not as a burden, but as a responsibility shaped by love. She understood that remembering the dead is one of the most concrete ways to live divine mercy daily. It requires no extraordinary gifts, no visions, no special roles, only fidelity. Jesus whispered, because this truth must be embraced freely. Forced mercy is not mercy. Chosen love is. Jesus finally led St. Faustina to understand that the warning about departed souls is, at its core, a warning about love that does not stop at death. He showed her that the measure of a soul's maturity is not how intensely it prays for itself, but how faithfully it remembers those who can no longer speak, choose, or act. Mercy reaches its fullness when it crosses the boundary of the grave. He taught her that souls, after death, exist in a state of complete truth. They see clearly what mattered and what did not. They understand with painful clarity the value of every prayer that was offered for them and the weight of every prayer that was withheld. This awareness does not produce bitterness. It produces longing, a longing that waits patiently for the assistance God desires to give through the living. Jesus warned Faustina that the greatest tragedy is not that souls undergo purification, but that many are forgotten. Forgetfulness is not neutral. It weakens charity on earth and delays consolation in eternity. When the living forget the dead, they unintentionally sever a channel of mercy that God Himself established. Divine mercy desires to flow through human cooperation, not around it. Saint Faustina understood that remembering the dead is not a sentimental act, it is a theological one. It affirms belief in eternal life, communion of saints, and the power of prayer. Jesus warned that when these practices fade, faith becomes reduced to ethics and routine. Eternity loses its urgency. Mercy loses its reach. Jesus also revealed that praying for the departed protects the living from illusion. It reminds the soul that it will one day depend entirely on mercy, not achievement. This awareness cultivates humility, patience, and gratitude. A soul that regularly prays for the dead learns to live with eternity in view. It becomes less attached to appearances and more attentive to truth. The warning Jesus whispered, therefore, is not a call to fear death, but to remember it rightly. Death is not an ending that dissolves responsibility. It is a passage that intensifies it. Love must continue. Prayer must continue. Mercy must continue. Saint Faustina received this teaching as a mission. She understood that divine mercy is not confined to extraordinary moments or mystical experiences. It is lived daily in simple acts of remembrance, in intentional prayers, in sacrifices offered quietly for souls who wait in hope. Jesus whispered because this teaching demands interior listening. Loud warnings provoke fear. Gentle warnings form conscience. He entrusted this truth to St. Faustina so that it would be transmitted not as threat, but as invitation. The invitation is clear. Remember the departed. Pray for them deliberately. Offer mercy without delay. In doing so, the living prepare their own souls for the day when they too will depend entirely on love. This is the warning Jesus whispered, and it remains one of the most neglected teachings of divine mercy.